Today at CAC, we have the honor of hosting Franklin Emeka from Criminal Justice, and Franklin's title is Juvenile Delinquency, Social Risk Factors of Gang Membership. Franklin.
Thank you for coming. I hope you do enjoy the presentation. What I want to talk about today has to do with gangs, which actually either pushes some button on some people or actually get some people to, put them in an uncomfortable situation per se. But what I want to do is show you research I have done that talks about gang from a different perspective. Gang, we all know, or we like to believe, is a bad thing. But quite frankly, I used to think that way until I did my research on this. And I began seeing gang from a different perspective. So my title is showing you some of the risk factors that's beyond the kids. Why would they join a gang? This is the format I'm going to use to talk to you about. So I'm going to try to keep it very succinct and organized and methodical in way of telling you that. So first I'm going to tell you what I am talking about, the concept of it, and then let you know which theory, although there are different theories you can relate to this, but I'm only going to discuss two, because that's for the purpose of our class. I'm also going to tell you why I'm doing what I'm doing, what actually piqued my interest, aside from me being a formal adult probation officer for almost 12 years here in Harris County. I'm going to let you know some of the basic studies I have done. I did do analysis on this using quantitative data, and I'm also going to tell you some of the statistical findings that I've had, including specifically using the descriptive analysis to talk about the data that I used to do this analysis. As you know, with any study, it does have limitations, which quite frankly opens the door for other people to explore. No research is conclusive. And then I'm going to talk about some of the implications and applications of it and open up the forum for discussion. Okay? There are two different ways we can do this. One, you can ask me questions as we go along, or you can just hang on until I finish. I'm all for dialogue as opposed to monolithic forum. So please ask questions as we go. We have 1 hour to talk to each other. Okay? What actually drew me to this is the same question that some people may have, which it's really more of a statement, a position. There's no reason why anyone should join gangs, period. Gang is a problem, and regardless of what your reason is, it's wrong. So with that mindset that I had, again, being influenced from what I used to do, I began looking at, gang is costly to the society. It's a progressive criminal behavior. I saw for myself, anecdotally, that people generally progress from, petty crime to bigger crime. At least that was my understanding. Also, for that reason, you got to look at how state legislatures have come along, which actually is a net widening. Juvenile crime, as we progress over time, actually we have criminalized kids. Behaviors that we used to engage in, we today have laws forbidding them from doing that. And we also, I wanted to know, do kids arbitrarily join gangs? Another thing, what actually lead them to becoming gang members, which led me again back to the social risk factors that are beyond their control. And essentially, I was trying to find out what are the contributors to gang membership. Now, I went on to, when I got data, I will share with you in a little bit, and I looked at, you can't test everything. So you pick variables that are relatable, that's also measurable. And these are the ones that I have actually picked based on the variables from the data that I used. I looked at race. How does race contribute to gang membership? How about gender? Are girls more likely to join gang compared to boys, or vice versa? And then I looked at family. Miller talked about how single parent families are the single producers of gang members. Is that true or not? And then what about economic hardship? How about kids who grow up in poor neighborhood? Are they more likely to join gangs, as we all assume? How about kids who are just afraid of getting beat up? I grew up, when I was in high school, that's when Nancy Reagan, if you remember, Just Say No campaign. Okay, the Just Say No, was it good enough? Or what could lead to that? Now, based on that, I looked at theoretical explanations. This is the one by Robert Martin, going back to 1968. It's really more of a positives type theoretical explanation. But what captured my attention was the tenets of it, which basically, this is my own interpretation. The tenets are essentially these categories. But then I was thinking, okay, what if life affords you opportunity? Quite frankly, you conform. For example, the opportunity you and I have today, believe it or not, is intelligence. You were able to go to school, read something, and be able to interpret it and pass a test. That's an opportunity. Some people may not necessarily have that. How about folks who don't have the opportunity to go to college like you and I? Quite frankly, they will look for ways. It's really about survival. When you invent a way that's either legal or illegal, you and I actually chose conformity in a way that being in college is socially accepted. It's a middle class value and it's socially acceptable. Now, what about kids who are not in college? They may actually get into something that we consider deviant. Now, deviance, it's only based on legal definition. If you look at what deviance is, because deviance can either be legal or illegal. Now, some of my studies that I wouldn't have time to go much more in depth compare Boy Scout to street gangs. If you look at Boy Scout, it's a form of deviance, but it's socially acceptable deviance. So those kids who don't go to that, may result to just get a job. You become a ritualist. By being a ritualist, you and I in here today, to some extent, we have become ritualists. Now, those who don't want to accept that might simply become retreatists, which we perceive as being lazy. And you look at the gang membership, gangs who are the ones who quite may not have gotten all of this, so they chose to rebel by engaging in behaviors that we consider deviant. And we call that crime. Another theory that I looked at, again, there are so many different ways of explaining this, but I chose two specifically so I can move on with time. It's social disorganization theory. There are some environments based on Shaw and McKay and Thresher that are it's really more of a criminogenic type environment. There are some neighborhoods, for example, you and I hope our car will not break down in the middle of the night, because at some point, about your safety. We also I looked at where do gangs thrive? What type of environment allows gang to prosper? Primarily in a social disorganized neighborhood. It's one of the places. And if you actually look at neighborhoods that are socially disorganized, there's actually perpetual social inequality, economic deprivation. Places that you and I call ghetto is nothing more than higher concentration of poverty, because we chose not to invest in that area. And because we don't invest in that area, they lack resources. Quite frankly, many people in places we call ghetto or poor neighborhood, they want to work, but they just don't have the jobs that fit their talent. And we have moved on to different type of resources today. For example, we are in tertiary industry, service-related industry, which required more intelligence compared to the 1940s when we had, carpet mills and people work with their hands per se. But then you looked at disrupted families. Now, this is the one where obviously, at least based on Miller, he said that single parent families are the ones who are producers of gang members. Well, let's see is that really true or not? At least the assumption is what we all think. Another thing that I saw this theory explained was mistaken deviance. Because depending on which neighborhood you're in, if you see 4 or 5 kids together, again, considering what I said earlier, it could be from age, race, gender, you think they're up to no good. It could be based on physical appearance. If you see kids wearing school uniform, you tend to think they're all about school, but if you see kids wearing certain type of clothing, we make assumptions. So keep that in mind as we go. The purpose of my study, again, like I said, was to look at some of these factors that could contribute to gang membership. Okay, I kept asking myself, why am I doing this? What's the problem statement here? What am I trying to show? And I looked at different types of, and I'm going to go through this quickly because this is actually cited in the literature that I used. Uniform Crime Report, which is UCR, looked at in 2007, some of the data that came, like violent crime in U.S., it's about slightly over 597,000. Okay, but if you actually look at which crimes committed by juvenile, it's really a fraction of it, about 2.8. Robertson talked about that, and Elroyd, and Shaw and McKay, whom I cited earlier, these are the people who talk about things like strain, hardship can lead to behaviors that in actuality is survival. However, we being the middle class tend to think of those behaviors as deviant. Now, here are some of the research questions that I formulated based on what I was looking at. To what extent is race associated? To what extent gender, family structure, economic hardship, fear of crime? What are the predictors of gang membership? Now remember, I used my study, it's both descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. So it's only relatable based on those, to that category of people, students who took that. We can't overgeneralize. Okay? So some of the methods that I used, I looked at qualitative and quantitative data, and it was much better for me to use quantitative data as opposed to qualitative data. And the nature of what I was trying to do, because it's very difficult to survey kids, because you have to first go through Industrial Review Board, IRB, and most, like K through 12, are overwhelmingly protective of kids. They wouldn't let you go there and have them answer questions. So it made sense for me to go and use secondary data. And the kids that were surveyed from gang resistance education and training were predominantly 8th graders. 8th graders being the stage where kids are more likely to go left or right. Now, going left in a sense would be joining street gangs. Going right would be becoming academically inclined. I used SPSS program. I'm not sure if, I'm pretty sure y'all are familiar with that, as opposed to any other.
Question?
Sure.
How do you define a gang? Like when I think of a gang, I know like they can have really complicated hierarchies,
right,
where people have really specialized functions. Like
right,
one person has to do this, and it's very well organized.
Right.
But like you have groups of friends or just people going to school. How does that fit like a gang? I mean, I could just have a misconception about what a gang is.
Well, gang, based on what I was looking at both from a deviance point of view. Deviance is anything that varies in degree and direction from the norm, which could be right or wrong. For as long as it doesn't fit where we are, we think of it as deviance. So the definition that I use to define gang are those that deviated from where we stand at middle class value, and based on that, those that are illegal. That's the category that I use. But again, what I found out was that, wait a minute, if you will, over time, you see that this is not really about kids who want to be thugs. It's part of, there are so many variables, like survival is part of it. I mentioned earlier about Nancy Reagan Just Say No campaign. Do I join a gang that will protect me going home, or do I get beat up every day going home? So that's I think that answers your question in terms of the definition that I used here. Okay? I used inferential statistics using logistical regression and Also, on my hypothesis, while holding these categories, this variable as independent, I then weighed it against gang membership and see what the outcome will be. And this is a descriptive statistics category that I used to define what I had looked at, the frequency and the distribution of it, and here are my results. Now, based on that data, the sum total of it is 5,935. But later on, you will see that out of the variables that I was looking at, only 800 of 5,935 answered questions that were relevant to my subject. But the data, the sum total that I looked at, 40% were Caucasian. This is based on race here. And I wish we had more of Asian Americans and Native Americans, but then that's also reflective of our population today based on census category. Gender, about 52%. Again, I was hoping that I get the opposite because of the perception we have that boys are more likely to join gangs than girls. But again, I can only analyze what I had. It wasn't based on my choice. The age I felt was pretty appropriate. Overwhelming majority of them fell under 14 or were 14 years old, identified themselves. This is that age where kids start to discover themselves per se. The beginning of troubled teenage years that could lead to outside activity more so than listening to parents. So, which was good. Now, based on family structure, again, going back to those variables that I chose, I had to have at least 50% of each category in order for me to say this is legitimate. Many of them live with both parents, okay? And you look at mothers only, fathers only. It's interesting where the kids surveyed, the majority of them lived with both parents, quite opposite of what one would think. And then mothers only comprised 27%, and fathers only was very, very dismal. Again, going back to grandparents raising kids was something else I was thinking. Like grandparents raising kids, you have kids with too much freedom and no discipline, and they do things that are not good for our society. Now, the side when I looked at the data, I think I went backwards. Did I go backwards? There we go. I'm sorry, but here's where I'm going. Now, given some of the things the questions that I had and based on the hypothesis, this is what SPSS gave me. For significance between, this is the one that looked at race. Okay, that's why I have this highlighted. The research variable that looked at race, I was actually hoping for much bigger results like race is it. Okay, quite frankly, most people don't say it, but they think minority kids just join gangs. That's what I was hoping to see. Is this true or not? Not necessarily. And I set the significance level at 0.5, which to me is statistically significant if you look at the margin of error. If you look at gender, okay, it shows statistical significance between male and female. If you look at gender, what are the likelihood that girls are more likely to become gang members compared to boys? And then I looked at family structure. Okay, there is significance between at least two groups. Okay, low percentage of juveniles who live in both parents compared to categories who are less likely to join gangs. Okay, and then I looked at economic hardship. Is it really the driver? Because the presumption is that single parent households generally have more difficulty with financial help, which leads to freedom. More freedom leads to more access, and more access leads to destructive behaviors like gang membership. Well, I didn't see what I considered, at least based on the data analysis, there was no significance associated with gang membership and economic hardship, which actually goes back. When I was doing this, I was too far into the theories I was using. So at that point, you just, because I wanted to go back and say, I told you so, but it wasn't so. The assumption that I had, quite frankly, was that kids who live in economically challenged neighborhood have highest probability of being gang members. At least that was the anecdotal, my own feeling, like, okay, I saw it as a probation officer, and for that reason, they're all gang members. That's not true. So, and to my surprise, I found the other. Now, this is the one I actually, again, just say no. At least that was the drive for me. Fear of crime. Okay, I don't want to get hurt. If I live in poor neighborhood, do I need protection? I didn't grow up, I grew up in Southeast Houston by Gulf Gate Mall area. It's changed if you know that area. And at the time when I was a kid going to Millby High School, I was thinking, I need someone to walk home with me. I didn't want to get in trouble, but at the same time, I didn't want to get beat up either. So I found no significance, at least based on the data analysis. Here are some of the predictors when I looked at all of them together. Okay, there are risk factors that actually were included, which was this: gender, economic hardship, and fear of crime. Okay, they did become some of the predictors. And also, family structure does not include the predictor. I mentioned two of them that didn't quite tell me what I want to see was family structure and family structure and race. Okay. Now, just to sum this up quickly, my study was not designed to be conclusive. It's just adding to what's there already. And because it was adding to what's there already, and it was a way to actually look at gang and study gang from a different perspective, as opposed to just buying into everyday, what I consider salacious infotainment we hear on the news. Oftentimes when you see something on the news, especially when we talk about juveniles, we don't really report about them from a positive point of view. Only recently have we started seeing, I would say, have I started seeing some things that were complimentary, but at the same time, it was all based on assumption. This is some of the problems, issues I had with the study. There were limitations. Okay, this again, SPSS to me didn't generate precisely some of the things. If you remember working with SPSS, just because the data is there does not mean SPSS will automatically include all of them. So some of it were missing. Another question I had was where the data was collected, which I considered limitation. Public schools in of itself does not include kids who drop out of school. When kids are not in school, it's more like unemployment. If you are not looking for a job, you won't be counted. So to me, the kids that we really need to survey were those who will drop out. So to me, I think we found what we wanted to find to some extent. So I consider that to be limitation. And another limitation I had was this is a self-reporting survey, which means that people could exaggerate or underreport. So I thought that was a problem. One of the things that I looked at when I thought gender again, the implication, we tend to nurture girls more so than boys, which actually, based on my data, not data analysis, my research and that I have looked at, one of the reasons why you see more men in prison is because more boys get more freedom compared to girls. We over-supervise girls compared to boys. Fathers especially are very, very protective of their girls compared to boys. So there's different type of socialization. Boys are encouraged to be risk takers, whereas girls are protected. Now, when I looked at economic hardship, I looked at money. Money can lead to problems. Sometimes people do things for survival, not necessarily because they want to be criminals, but it's just a matter of survival. And then when I looked at crime, some kids join gangs for protection. Okay, I'll be honest with you, when I was 16 years old, and I didn't quite understand, if I got beat up a couple of times, someone would say, hey, come with me, just high probability, I'd like, watch my back. But now that I'm older, I don't have to worry about that. And I also looked at, again, socialization. If we have equal supervision for boys and girls, I think this study will probably have even explanation. And also, if we maximize employment, I remember reading one article in particular that talked about how we can actually use economics to fight crime. If we invest in poor neighborhoods, we actually create, you know, the gentrification we see today is because we actually decide, even using taxes, if we give tax incentives to gentrify poor neighborhoods, it would allow businesses to move in, which creates jobs. So that actually in itself can help that neighborhood get out of that rut, for example. And also the fear of crime provide, you know, I know this is probably exaggerating, provide escort services for kids. If a child goes to, in high school goes to the principal said, I'm afraid of walking home. If you remember, at least I want to say for Texas, if you live less than 2 miles away from the school, you don't get bus service. Okay, I think it's still true today. Okay, those are the kids to me that I was thinking of when I thought about this. And it's not necessarily having people that we pay. We can have grandparents who would volunteer just simply to walk those kids home. And that might help. So, just again, to put it all together, this is simply an explanation. It's not a conclusive or definitive result. It's just adding to body of knowledge. And some of the things that I looked at that I wanted to add on my end was to look at some of the intrinsic and extrinsic motivators for people. Extrinsic being external, intrinsic meaning from within. We tend to look at race as a divisive subject when in actuality it shouldn't be. We also look at intrinsically, you know, one of the articles I was actually reading pertaining to race led me to read a whole lot more about KKK. You know, I promise you it changed my whole perspective. Okay, it's a sense of belonging. It's not necessarily about what we think it is. It's the same thing, like you and I here have a sense of belonging to this campus. When you come here, go into your office, there's a sense of belonging that's very difficult to explain. It's the same thing for kids who may join gangs, because we naturally, most of us will go to where we are welcomed. And also I looked at social privileges attached to gender. Boys are given more permission to do more than girls, which actually lead to behaviors that are risky. Family structure. Okay, you and I we have no control over being born in this country. This is a darn good place to be compared to other places. It's the same thing when you look at neighborhoods. Okay? No kid chooses to be born in criminogenic neighborhood per se. So child abuse is one thing that some kids can't help. Now, remember, these are the things that I added on myself. Like, okay, what about what I did? What's the answer? Or what do I think is the answer? Social privileges. Okay. Social privileges can, if you look at the way, I remember reading an article that talked about school districts. You can have one school district that for some reason in this neighborhood the kids have everything they need. The same school district, if you go to a different zip code, they barely survive. Okay? And then you look at, from extrinsic factor, yes, some kids may be seeking protection, but intrinsically, if they don't get protection they need, it could lead to anxiety. So these are the things that I looked at. And of course, with any research, you recommend for someone else to explore. Hopefully someone in here can take the interest to explore more about this and educate us more. But that's essentially what my presentation is about. Thank you.
But you mentioned you use SPSS to create random data, or what do you use the SPSS random generating function for?
You have to, remember I have 5935 total.
That's right.
Okay, and when you input all of that data in there, you can only pick, like I picked 6 variables. So that actually looked at those and also randomized it. So based on that randomization, 800 was populated. And those are the ones that that's why I was saying that's, again, with limitations, that's obvious. But I could only analyze, I wish I was able to analyze 5,900, and maybe I can be more confident in my confidence level with the data.
Have you looked at the adult situation older than 18 to see if they compare somehow?
That sounds pretty interesting, but no, because the program I was in, the PhD program I was in was juvenile justice.
I see.
Yeah, we did. We did look at that, but they wanted all of us, or I should say, they made all of us do a dissertation piece on juvenile related. But I did read so many, and that's why I came up with that progression of criminal behavior. Many people who became institutionalized as a kid, because they have gone in and out of jail, eventually resort to the lifestyle they know best for survival. But it was not included on this for the sake of the paper. Okay?
I have a question.
Sure.
Has there ever been a case in history like where they had a lot of gangs, and like you said, they put in some economic development? Like I'm thinking like Depression had like Polish gangs and Italian gangs, and we don't seem to have those kinds of gangs now, but at that time there was lots of low income. Were there cases where they actually put in a company or an industry in a town and they noticed that a lot of that gang activity went away?
Well,
or like in
based on
the Irish gangs of the 1850s, stuff like
Right.
that.
Well, based on everything I have read, including and especially for this, no, I have not come across any such data. I'm sure it exists, but I just didn't read that one. But to answer your question, I will cite 2 people. One would be a study done by Platt that looked at the history of gang membership from Irish that you were talking about, going to specifically urban area. He talked about how Irish, when they came, they were not actually given access to, like you and I have, the social privileges. And many of them actually had kids who had nowhere to go. And then you had the philanthropist, a woman who actually began the movement to help kids. And that in of itself led to different things that they did for like camp. If you look at some of the things we have today as residual of that, could be more like boot camp, even though later on it didn't work. Another one I would cite would be a study done by Cesar Lombroso, who at the time in the 1800s was a medical doctor. And he was trying to explain how some people can actually be born criminals. And this was a situation in Germany at the time, but at the time it made sense, but only less than a decade later we found that he didn't know what he was talking about. You can't define people using eugenics as an example. No one is born criminal. Even though you may have a parent who may be on death row, that doesn't mean you're going to be, then it goes into the sociobiological explanation. Okay? Are you born a criminal or were you nurtured into criminal behavior? So another theory I wanted to use too, but I didn't want to go too much in depth, was social learning theory. Did you learn to be a criminal by being around folks who are criminal, or were you born that way? Think of it like who corrupted who. If a kid joins a group of kids who are in private school and those kids turn bad, who corrupted who? Were they criminals waiting to be tapped into, or did the kid who joined them become the criminal who corrupted them? So social learning theory was another one I wanted to add, but they said my dissertation was about 300 pages and it was crossed down to 99 pages. So there's a whole lot that was not included on here that I thought should be part of it, but obviously not. But those are the only two factors I would cite. Okay.
Continuing Nathan's question, you said you grew up in Gulf Gate area. Now you drive over there, what do you think? Do you think the economic development has changed the area or not? Because it has drastically changed,
Right.
even though you can see it from the highway when you drive by. I used to teach at Houston Community College across the highway. And,
Okay.
Yeah.
Right off Woodridge area?
Rustic Road, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
that's right.
if you look at the gentrification in Houston, Houston has gone through a lot of transition. Do I think it's better? Not necessarily. I think we don't necessarily have to let community completely go south before we allow tax incentives. I think Houston City Council members are doing good, if you were to ask me. But people in of itself, if you look, I'm using demographic transition theory, you can't help but how people move. And this economic shift, I'm using Houston as an example. So I think it's gotten better from where it was in the 1980s. But at the same time, it wasn't as good as I knew as a kid growing up. Because at some point, that area was pretty affluent neighborhood to grow up in. But then it completely just,
It went down and then now
it's picking up.
Yeah.
It's picking up. It's picking up.
You're going to put resources, if you're recommending resources to help reduce this problem, what would be the one thing where you would put money allotted?
Family. Family, I think, is the most important. If you were to ask me, for years I was an adult probation officer before I even went to this doctoral program. I saw kids who grew up without direction. And it's ironic to me from psychology who explains the development of our brain. It's not fully, and please correct me, I'm not a psych major, but based on what I read, our brain fully developed on around the age of 24, 25. And the most important part of being the frontal lobe of our brain, which controls our impulsivity, is not fully developed. But in Texas, if you are 17 years old, you commit a crime, we process you as an adult, which to me is the beginning of, it's a trajectory that almost always most people don't recover from. It's again, that's just, I will put into family, because family become the gatekeepers for any kid that might go south. Does it always work? Not really, but I think I would be one.
That was something, your statistics showed that, and again, maybe you said you were trying to find something, and I think we intuitively think we'll find certain things, but
Right.
the fact that most of these kids were coming out of two-parent homes,
Right.
just because they're married, right, doesn't, I mean, I think we put a lot of that responsibility on the father or the mother,
Right.
but just because it's a two-parent home doesn't mean that they're there.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think I'd
Absolutely.
be interested in a latchkey phenomenon. You
Right.
discussed control to a certain extent. So
Right.
how many jobs were going on for both of those parents or either of those parents? How present, quote unquote, were those individuals at that point in time?
Right.
Because I would have expected that too, more single parent due to the economic strain.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I don't remember seeing that particular variable in the data that I looked at, because I looked at so many different variables there based on the questionnaire to see, okay, which one would I choose as a risk factor. But I did read an article, especially stemming from Miller, that I used on here, that talked about how single parent families tend to have kids that are not as supervised, whereas, you know, both kids growing up with both parents have higher probability of having one or the other check up on them at any time. So I'm not sure if that would actually be absent parenting with both parents working most of the time. I'm not sure that would be statistically significant if we were to, although it could be, you know, I'm curious to know too.
Or after-school programs. I mean, you mentioned family is a place to put money, but an after-school program as a stopgap. Big brothers, big sisters as a stopgap. Sports as a stopgap.
Right.
Things like that.
You've heard of Brian Stevenson, haven't you? The attorney who works with death row inmates.
Okay.
And I'm just finishing his third row.
Okay.
And it talks about how they were in gangs. And because even if they were young, they were tried as adults.
Right.
And then they spent 30 years paying something they did as a kid.
Right.
And he has changed some of those laws, but I couldn't believe it. That it was that ridiculous.
You know, I just think one of the residual effect of technology is unforgiveness. Unforgiveness from a legal perspective. If you do something silly at 17, but now that you're in college, now that you've graduated, I think we should allow at least those kids who have demonstrated growth a chance to expunge their record. Even with me being a criminal justice professor here, I promise you Tuesday there was a young lady that's in my class, and she came to me crying. I'm like, okay, what did I do? Because we only took a test. And she was telling me how she got into trouble when she was younger because of the young man she was dating. And now she's about to graduate. And she's looking forward to her graduation, but in the back of her mind is this record. Like, is that going to keep me from getting a job? I wish I could help her. All I told her was get an attorney and see if, file for expulsion. File for expulsion. If they wouldn't accept that based on whatever she may have, then file for selective seal, which will keep employers from seeing that, although the police will still have access to it. But we are pretty unforgiving. I think we need to at least reconsider what we do with criminal history, especially as people mature.
Nathan's question was really interesting because, I'm not sure, frankly, to my satisfaction, there was an operational definition of gang, because the football team is a gang.
Right.
And when I was in high school, they were pretty delinquent.
That's
they
true.
really were.
Right.
they had colors and they went out together and they, messed people up and stuff up and things like that.
Right.
The Boy Scouts is a gang, but a socially appropriate gang. Again, I don't think there's a bumper sticker that says "My son's a Crip," or "My son's a Blood." I'm proud of my Crip son or something like that. So, I guess that's where deviance comes in. But I think that there's multiple ways to operationally define gang that I know I personally am not familiar. I think being here in the Woodlands, people tag stuff, but it's like West Side Woodlands or something like that, and it's not really hardcore. So, I just appreciate you shedding some light on this, but it's such a foreign world to me a gang is, as Nathan was saying, maybe it's a group of Irish or a group of Catholic or. Coming to work today, there was a girl whose car was tagged with Young Life stuff. Right. So I don't think they were going to go beat anybody up. But so anyway, I'm still not sure. I think you know what a gang is when you see a gang, but as a psychologist, I want it to be operationally defined in some way, so that I can say that's a gang, that isn't.
Well, I actually struggled with that question when I was doing this. Okay. Like, if we say gang, whose gang? Whose definition? Then I went back to Elijah Anderson's book. He talked about middle class values. Middle class value is really the operational definition for most everything we do, at least based on what I read by him. And then I also looked at it made me question what is normal? Whose moral are we using? And then I went back to things that are either legal or illegal, moral or immoral. These four categories became the basis that I talked about more in depth. Because if we think something is moral, we all accept it. If we get to the point where we don't quite tolerate it, we think of it as immoral. That doesn't mean it's illegal. But if it's grossly or becomes grossly immoral, then we codify it as illegal. So that, to me, became an issue for me. Whose morality are we using? Then it goes back to social values. Whose definition are we using to operate as a Western culture? It's really where the majority is, which is middle class. And because middle class says you should abide by these certain behaviors to some extent. In fact, if you analyze your classroom, there are certain behaviors that are acceptable in a classroom. And then there are certain behaviors we will frown upon if a kid who comes from a lower class, who's not accustomed to that, if they behave that way, it's like our antenna goes up. Or in fact, you may see the way they dress. I have a kid in my class, and for some reason right now I feel like I have to keep protecting him. Because from he's very, he says he's conservative, but I just see him differently. Every type of crime we mention, he said, just cut off their hand. He said, and I asked him, I said, that's Sharia law. Are you implicating Sharia?
Is he Muslim?
No, it's not even Muslim. So, but to me, I welcome that type of opinion in a way that if we don't have someone, according to Emil Durkheim, who said something or do something that shock all of us, then we wouldn't have consensus of what we think is normal. And because he said something like that, and everyone went, how can you, this is democracy. Then, okay, let's talk about democracy. This is not true democracy, is what I tell them. The criminal justice system, I wanted to also use conflict theory, Marxist theory. It's nothing more than criminalization focusing on the behaviors of the poor. The poor, they don't have representation enough to say, no, that's not law, or that shouldn't be law. So you can tell how confused I became after I got through doing this. Like, what's the point of this?
A gang is a functional group.
Yes.
Not officially sanctioned. Not officially sanctioned.
Right.
Thus, there's an outlaw marginal character
right.
to the concept. So
right.
if if I said, well, look at that gang of physicists. That automatically,
They're all gangs.
that automatically suggests that you all share some non-official theory of the universe. You're
Exactly.
physicists outlaws or something.
Right.
Whenever we use the term gang,
Right.
it seems to be intended to marginalize
Absolutely.
or to diminish. So even in Congress, for example, that group of senators, I forget how many there were, 7 or 8, the gang of whatever they were.
Gang of 7, I
They
think.
came up with the plan for integrating people who are not citizens into American society. You know what I'm talking about? They were referred to as a gang
Right.
because it wasn't sanctioned by the Senate.
Absolutely.
They came up with a plan that the majority had a problem with. So
Right.
gang is always a term we seem to use when we want to diminish something.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah, but, I mean, it's classical conditioning, but I equate gang with violence. Otherwise, then it's a happy gang, right? I mean, let people be a gaggle or a murder or whatever, but, gang, I was curious, I was talking to him earlier about, to me, ISIS is the ultimate gang right now,
Right.
So moving beyond our borders into something that's international. So I'm worried about at-risk youth and domestic issues, but why do we have this giant amassing of it? You have a power void, and then you have predominantly men, but also women,
Right.
ironically, who are joining a group that's
Well, they don't call themselves a gang. We're the ones who identify them as a gang
Right.
to diminish them. They don't see themselves
True,
as
yes.
a gang.
Right.
And those in such a group who would see themselves that way
Right.
would have some agenda, some
Right.
political agenda of some kind, right?
Yeah, that's true.
With any kind of rationalization. But I can't think of any example where we use the term gang as a compliment.
In my mind, I think when I think about gang, I think about like organized criminal activity.
They're
Right.
rascals.
That's true.
And so, but like, the Italian mafia,
Right.
that's not a poverty gang. That's a gang associated with running industries and businesses. And they had, racketeering and extortion and all that kind of stuff. But that's definitely would be an interesting study about gangs, because that's talking about people making millions of dollars. And there's a hierarchy, there's rituals to get in, it's a lifelong commitment, you can't come out. They use violence for their means.
And they see themselves as so they'll say, this is the only way we can get justice.
Exactly.
So it's not officially sanctioned by the powers that be, obviously.
Like in the book The Godfather, he didn't feel that, one of the guys felt that he wasn't getting justice.
Right.
So he went to the Godfather. Godfather said, for a favor, I will go beat up those guys for you.
Right.
That would never be legal,
Yeah.
but that was what a lot of people used it for.
What do we mean when we say, like, I've signed this before, like, Merry Christmas from Tom and Mary and the whole gang? Now, you might say, that's not negative.
Right.
But I don't mean, it's not negative in the typical sense.
Right.
But it does suggest a certain
Affiliation.
informality and non-structure.
Right.
And the whole gang, not the whole family, not the whole hierarchy.
Yeah, but the whole gang.
With the mafia, that's a euphemism as well, right? It's not just that I'm from this family, that family. I'm just saying I'm in the family,
Exactly.
right?
Right,
So,
right.
I just want to throw out this term. I have an honors student working on evil, the psychology of evil, and we're looking at capital E, lowercase e. But this term we keep coming back to is collective identity, which is a sociological idea as well. And
Right.
they're really discussing that from an in-group, out-group perspective. So
Right.
it's been a while since I've studied social psych from a student perspective, or even taught it here at the college.
Right.
In-group and out-group biases and identity,
Right.
they're necessary, but they're also can become a necessary evil. So as she explores that further, I'll be revisiting that idea of, collective identity makes it about I'm protecting your back.
Right.
And that's how the army works, and that's
Right.
how the military works. It's not about fighting for the country. It is, but it's
Exactly.
also about fighting for the guy that's next to you in the foxhole.
Exactly.
And then in gangs, it's not about being a cripper of blood necessarily. I'm going to use those stereotypical 1980s, 90s examples,
Right.
but it's about fighting for your brother that's right next to you, or your Irish brother, or your Italian brother, or again for the family or village name.
Well,
So-
and you're expected to function for the good of the whole very strictly in any gang organization. You know, when you have to make the sacrifice,
Right.
the gang comes first, and a lot of those organizations.
Right. And then, of course, there's it's a big onion to peel into, but then there's the initiation rites.
Right.
You know, and the steeper that those are, usually the stronger the affiliation with the gang. So there's ritualistic hazing is part of that, but then initiation in and of itself that creates that collective identity. Because you've been through something, it's a polar field of social psych, but you
Right.
can be really dissonant to get out of it.
Right.
Well, is she reading the Hannah Arendt?
No, tell me
She
the
must
name.
read Hannah Arendt
Oh, yeah.
on the Nazis.
Yeah, I've read it, oh, yeah.
Right.
Right.
And then also the novel Lord of the Flies
Yeah, that
that explores all the implications
Right.
philosophically and sociologically and psychologically of gang membership and the relationship between the individual and the
I
group.
wish I read that. I should have met you when I wanted to read everything I can about this group.
Hannah Arendt's book, I believe, is what she writes about what she calls the banality
Mhm.
of evil.
Yeah, that's
Right.
that's a term that we're exploring. Yeah, the banality of evil.
Well, they ought
It's
to read
called-
where it comes from. It comes from Hannah
Okay.
Arendt.
Yeah.
Hmm.
The other book I read for my master's was Beyond Good and Evil.
Hmm.
Nietzsche. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
But there was also a modern book by that same title.
Hmm.
Close
Yeah.
to it. It's pretty interesting.
There's a big, well, philosophy of evil is a big issue. Better to take off a little piece of it.
Right. She wanted.
All right, a little piece of it,
Right.
and do something in depth, and try to skirt across the whole thing in a rowboat.
Well, that's from our side. It's Phillips and Barter wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect, and it's an extension of the Stanford Prison Experiment stuff. And so, it's not particularly gang related, but it's just was illustrative of how simply you can just change someone's clothing
Right.
and their role, and within less than 2 weeks, you've really changed their behavior to being victimized or bullies.
Right.
So that's the take we're going with, because
Well, I think another great example was I went to a summer program once, and all the faculty members, some at very distinguished universities, stayed in the dorms. And it didn't take more than 48 hours, right, before they started acting like college students. All right. It's, the environment.
Environment.
And, the clothes matter and all of that, but just the environment.
Right.
It changes the paradigms of the behavior, right?
That's what University of Chicago wrote extensively about, social disorganization. The reason I thought that one was pretty relevant to what I was doing. Sometimes the environment we're in can encourage certain behavior that group may not see as criminal, but outsiders looking in will label it. We are very good at finding faults with other people. Going back to what you said earlier about Italian mafia, when I read about them in organized crime, actually it was a matter of survival, because at the time when Italians came here as immigrants, they were not given citizenship. And because they were not given citizenship, they were denied access to mainstream economic like we have. And they began their own, and over time, during the Industrial Revolution era is when they actually learned that, hey, wait a minute, I can use my affiliation and identity to get access, believe it or not, through political donation. If I can get access to these people who are in the mainstream, then they will give me the immunity I need to do what I need to do. And then they also talked about two types of justice. You and I right now, if we were to get in trouble or someone were to, let's say, hit us, we call the police, we call 911. Well, what if you are illegal alien and someone hurt you? You don't call the police. You go to your mafia member, say, hey, I need you to help me settle scores. So you have illegal justice and illegal justice going simultaneously. And every now and then we see on the news like gang members are doing this, or terrorists. We label people that we don't understand as either gang members or terrorists. Because even United Nations cannot define who the terrorist is. Terrorist to us is freedom fighter to someone else. And people with different causes. Again, it goes back to that in-group, out-group vices and virtues you mentioned. So there's history for us. I'm not sure how true this is, and please chime in, that our country at any given time need a particular group of people or groups of people to blame our problems on. That creates a sense of unity for all of us as an American when we actually have a common goal. Like right after 9/11, we all collectively agree that we have a common goal. But if you follow the trend of 9/11 till now, is that common goal still as strongly defined as it was after September 11th? So but this took me to all kinds. You see how I got 300 pages? It's just saying, stay focused, stay focused. But I hope you.
What would your next book be, your next study? Would it be an extension of something from this one, or would it be something going in a different direction?
My wife has published several articles and written quite a few. The one that piques my interest is victimization from a completely different point of view. Victimization in a sense that not every victim is a victim. I think we tend to exaggerate our perception of victim, and we tend to think, for example, from a crime point of view, that is, every person who is a victim of crime, for some reason, they're just complete innocent people, and someone just come and victimize them. Take, for example, the ones you see. I was really looking at more like case studies as opposed to, book in of itself, like home invasion. Overwhelming percentage of people who are victims of home invasion, actually, they know who came in. Because if you don't know I have $1 million in my closet, why would you even come to my house? If I had drugs, it's an invite to come in and take. So to some extent, I don't think every victim is a victim. Now, that's not to minimize, criminal or crime victims, but I think in many instances, if we look at it individually, not every victim who claims to be a victim is truly a victim. It's a result of your association. That's something that had piqued my interest, and now am I going into that? I'm not sure, because I'm not sure people will agree with me. They probably said you're wrong.
What do you find the majority of your criminal justice students are the ones who tell you they want to go into it, are interested in? What area of criminal justice are you finding they're particularly drawn to? Is it juvenile justice or something else?
No, it's not juvenile. Juvenile justice is something that just came very, very recently to the scene. In fact, as women's rights became more evident in our culture, so too the juvenile justice go along with it. No, most of them either gravitate towards this cops and robber. The TV is doing an excellent, they advertise for us. It's all about CSI. Then when I tell them CSI is not a degree, they're like, what do you mean CSI is not a degree? No, it's forensics. It's forensics. You need to go into forensics. Combination of science and criminal, but most of them come from confused point of view. They think of CSI, and I tell them this is not CSI, but actually most of them get better understanding, especially after the intro, because what does it mean to be a police officer? Why do we need police officers to be educated? And why do we have police officers? If you look at all this ratio in the windows you see on TV, to me, they're actually neglecting the main problem, which is mental illness. If you're a police officer, what do you do? Like a guy who had machete yesterday saying he had devil in him, he wants to die. That's suicide by police. It's mental illness. It has nothing to do with black, white, or the way the media portray it. So I hope most of them, when getting better understanding, they go home, okay, now go back and analyze. But I think it's more of a, if I were to say, I would say overwhelming majority of them go into policing, and the other ones are interested in the court system. If I were to divide it in that category.
Well, thank you, Franklin.
Thank you.